Well, you're listening to Meeting House here on Faith Radio, and we certainly appreciate the work of First Liberty Institute, and it is great to welcome the Vice President of Litigation and Senior Counsel for First Liberty, David Hacker. And earlier this week, Aaron and Melissa Klein, you may remember they are the former owners of Sweet Cakes by Melissa, and this is actually a case that has been going on for about a decade or so, and they have been in and out of court. Their case has been all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. There were oral arguments that were heard before the Oregon Court of Appeals earlier this week. And so, David Hacker from First Liberty, thanks, first of all, for taking some time to review for our listeners some of the dynamics of this very important case. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. It's a pleasure to be here, and happy to talk about the Kleins and really the importance of their case, not only to them but for people across the country. It's a hugely important case for people that operate businesses according to their faith.
Absolutely. And I was just sharing with you, it looks like that back in 2015, I had the opportunity, thanks to our friends at Family Research Council, to meet Aaron and Melissa. We talked about this overall case. And of course, it was already in progress. So when I say it's about a decade or so, this is a tremendously long ordeal that they have been through. So David, take us back to the initial days, how this case got started in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, it has been going on for so long. And so what happened originally is that Aaron and Melissa Klein owned a bakery in Oregon called Sweet Cakes by Melissa. It was a successful bakery, and Melissa is a great cake artist, along with her husband, Aaron. And they did just these, beautiful wedding cakes that you see at weddings these days. And some customers, potential customers came in and indicated to them that they wanted a cake for a same-sex wedding, which was then at that point where the clients just kind of said, hey, I don't think that's something we're going to be able to do because of our faith and, what the creative process that we go through in making cakes that are special and meaningful for a wedding ceremony, which we believe is ordained by God. We just can't participate in something like that. And so those customers eventually went, and they actually got another cake from kind of a nationally known cake cake artist, and they had their wedding. But that was not the end of the story. They were not pleased with what Aaron and Melissa were doing in terms of operating their business according to their faith. So they complained to the state of Oregon, who then investigated them and ultimately came down and charging them and fining them $135,000. And that put the Kleins out of business. They were not able to continue, and since then, they have been fighting that damages award and that ruling. It's been knocked down over time to only $30,000, but that's still a large sum of money, and the Kleins still have had to close down their business and are still kind of rebuilding from that. And yet the judgment against them still stands. And so, yes, this case has been going on for quite some time. It's actually gone up to the U.S. Supreme Court twice. And the U.S. Supreme Court has told the Oregon courts, you're wrong twice. And so now this week we were back in front of those Oregon courts, again, asking them, hey, let's do the right thing. Let's protect the religious liberty of Aaron and Melissa Klein.
David Hacker is joining us today here on the Meeting House on Faith Radio. He is Vice President of Litigation and Senior Counsel for First Liberty as we talk about the case involving Aaron and Melissa Klein, the Sweet Cakes by Melissa case. And so you had this couple, they got their cake from another Baker. Nevertheless, they decided to complain against the Kleins. So if you would, take us through this overall timeline. You mentioned earlier it's been to the U.S. Supreme Court. It was in the Oregon Court of Appeals earlier this week as a result of the U.S. Supreme Court sending it back to Oregon for a second time. So tell me about this road that they have traveled, if you would, please.
Yeah, it's really been a road of trials. And so initially what happened is there was an administrative hearing in front of the Bureau of Labor and Industries there in Oregon. And really the deck was stacked against Aaron and Melissa from the beginning. The judge in the case was not acting in a way that would embody impartiality, and said some things that were extremely hostile to people of faith as he was ruling on the case. And so that was kind of the first indication that or the first reason why the U.S. Supreme Court sent this case back, was because that administrative judge from what they call BOLI, the Bureau of Labor and Industries, had so tainted the process with hostility to religion that the U.S. Supreme Court said, you can't do that. Let's send this back to Oregon. Okay, so that was the first go round. It comes back, and we again argued it in front of the Oregon Courts of Appeals there. They again issued an adverse ruling. They did partially the right thing, if you will, and reduced that damages amount that the Kleins were forced to pay from $135,000 down to $30,000. But still, they left the judgment against them, that they had somehow discriminated and violated Oregon law because they followed their faith. And so we argued again, no, this is not correct. And in the interim, the U.S. Supreme Court, like I mentioned earlier, they took another case called 303 Creative, and they decided that case last June. And that was a case about a wedding website designer, and she won her case that she's allowed to not participate in weddings that violate her sincerely held religious beliefs. And so we argued that the Supreme Court should, basically undo what the Oregon Courts of Appeals had done in Aaron and Melissa's case, and they agreed. They sent their case back down again to Oregon. And so this week is where we were in Oregon again at the Court of Appeals, arguing to basically the same court, hey, this needs to end. Aaron and Melissa have been going through this for a decade now. The First Amendment clearly protects their right and the right of all Americans of different perspectives and beliefs to not be forced to use their artistic and creative abilities to send a message with which they disagree. So that was the argument that we were making this week to the Oregon Court of Appeals.
And just a little bit of a procedural matter here. When you talk about the Oregon Court of Appeals, is Oregon set up kind of like the federal level where you have the district court, then you have the appeals court, and then a Supreme Court, which is sort of what it has, the same sort of hierarchy in the state of Alabama, or is the Court of Appeals kind of the final authority in the state of Oregon?
Yeah, great question. No, that they are the intermediate appellate court, we call it. And so there is an Oregon Supreme Court, but each time we have asked that court to get involved, which is a discretionary thing for them to do, they have not wanted to take this case. So we've always kind of gone from a decision at the Oregon Court of Appeals, the intermediate level. We've asked the Oregon Supreme Court, they've said no, and then we've gone to the U.S. Supreme Court, and twice the U.S. Supreme Court has said, we're going to undo this and send it back down to the Oregon courts to try to get it right. So that's kind of the process of what the Kleins have had to go through.
And I'm going to walk into this, and please correct me if I say it incorrectly, but basically you had that original damage award of $135,000. When the U.S. Supreme Court sent the case back down to Oregon after the Masterpiece decision, this court, the Oregon Court of Appeals, actually reduced the amount of damages to $30,000. That is where it stands now. But they never really, as I understand it, they never really changed or reduced the charges or reversed the charges against Aaron and Melissa, correct?
That's right. They still had ruled against them based on their beliefs and said that they had violated Oregon law because of what they did. And so that's kind of what we're dealing with now. Is we're dealing with the fact that the Kleins still have this court judgment that says they violated Oregon law, and they have the additional damages that have been reduced but are still significant. And none of that should have ever happened. You know, the First Amendment protects the rights of all Americans to create and use their artistic skills to honor, their faith and honor God if they choose to. And think about it. If you were to commission a painter, obviously they're using their artistic skills to create something for you, and they may not want to do the project you've asked them to do. And it's the same thing with the Kleins. They're artists who are creating these beautiful cakes for weddings, which are a celebration of the union of a man and a woman, under in the eyes of God, and that's something the First Amendment protects.
Well, David Hacker is joining us today here on the Meeting House on Faith Radio with First Liberty. We're talking about this case involving Aaron and Melissa Klein, the former owners of Sweet Cakes by Melissa. Tell me how much the Kleins have paid so far, if you could.
Well, yeah, with the original $135,000, they had to pay all of that. And so that was what was so damaging, and ended up, they had to shut down their business, and, they're still in the process of rebuilding from that here nearly a decade later. And so the fact that the court has reduced that now is good in part, like I said before, but they are still suffering under this. And so, imagine if you were, if you were suddenly confronted with a bill of that magnitude that you had to pay to the government solely because you followed your faith. And obviously that's something I think most Americans would agree is wrong.
So it sounds like to me, just not being an attorney, but it sounds like to me that the state of Oregon, at least the very minimum, owes the Kleins $100,000.
Right. That's right.
Does it work that way, though?
Well, it it takes time because even if you pay that money into the state, you have to basically get to the end of the case to and win if you want to get all that money back. And so that's what we're trying to do now, is get some finality for the Kleins so that they can have all their money back and continue on their journey of rebuilding and doing what they love to do.
Wow. So what was the tone or the content of the hearing earlier this week before the Oregon Court of Appeals?
Yeah, the tone was, I think, one where we obviously were pointing out the fact that this has been going on so long, and the U.S. Supreme Court has now, vacated two of the decisions from the Oregon Court of Appeals, and it's time for the court to get the law right. And so they, the court asked really great questions, I think. They were well aware of the 303 creative decision from last June at the U.S. Supreme Court and how that, they asked a lot of questions about how that case impacts the Kleins case. And, I'm hopeful that the court will do the right thing and rule in favor of the Kleins. But regardless, First Liberty and our volunteer attorneys that we work with will continue to fight for the Kleins as long as it takes to get them justice and to protect their First Amendment rights.
And what's interesting is that this case, as you mentioned, we've been talking about it having reached the Supreme Court level twice. It's been sent back down, once in light of Masterpiece, the other in light of the 303 creative decision. Seems like there are a lot of principles here that would be favorable to the Kleins. Obviously, in light of Masterpiece, the Court of Appeals reduced the damage award to $30,000. Now you've got it going back to the Supreme Court, sent back down. What are some of the legal principles at play, not only with 303 Creative, but also dating back to the Masterpiece case that are helpful to making the Kleins case here?
Yeah, well, in the Masterpiece case, that was one where a cake baker in Colorado had to go before the Colorado Human Rights Commission, was charged with, alleged discrimination against some customers, and the Supreme Court found that what happened during that process is just overt and extreme hostility to religion. So much so that members of that commission making comments about the Masterpiece Cake Shop and what they didn't like about it and whatnot. And so the Supreme Court said this is an obvious First Amendment violation when you have a government agency like that just displaying hostility openly and on the record towards religion. That violates the First Amendment. And so here we had the Bureau of Labor and Industries in Oregon doing a similar thing with the the comments made about the Kleins and what they thought of their religion not being extremely harmful to the Kleins and hateful towards them. And so the court originally sent the Kleins case back for those same reasons as the Masterpiece case, that hostility to religion. But now, like I said earlier, that part of the case has kind of been fixed to some degree, but now we have the 303 Creative decision. And there, the court encountered a wedding website designer, and she had not been, prosecuted like the Kleins or like Masterpiece, but she went and she filed a lawsuit against the state of Colorado and said, I'm afraid that because of the way I run my business, according to my faith, that I'm going to be prosecuted. And I only do website and creative work for projects that I fully agree with, according to my faith and my beliefs. And the Supreme Court said, this is a clear example of the First Amendment protecting her right to operate her business according to her faith. And so, that decision obviously has major impacts for the Kleins. And we're hopeful that the Oregon Court of Appeals will see how that case really controls the outcome here and dictates that Aaron and Melissa should have full First Amendment protection. There should have been no, investigation or discipline by the state of Oregon, and that they should prevail in their case.
This raises, and if you don't mind my indulgence here for just a moment, but this does raise a question. So the Supreme Court issues a ruling, and you have the officials that are tasked with carrying that ruling out, or in this case where you have a state court that is essentially not complying with the ruling of the U.S. Supreme Court. What generally happens from a legal standpoint when the courts are not doing what they are supposed to do?
Yeah, I think you've seen that here in the Kleins case. They've had to go to the U.S. Supreme Court twice now and ask it to intervene and correct the decisions of the lower courts. And thankfully, the Supreme Court has done that. But that's the process. If the court that you're in front of issues a ruling that you believe is wrong on the law, and here we believe the court in the past did get those rulings wrong, then you have to go to the next highest court. And we've done that twice, and thankfully the Supreme Court has agreed with us, and hopefully three's a charm here, and we'll be able to win this one here at the Oregon Court of Appeals this time.
Well, David Hacker joining us today here in the Meeting House on Faith Radio, and people can go to the website First Liberty. You spell it out, FIRST, liberty.org, and they can follow this as well as other cases in which you're involved. And I appreciate the time that you've taken to be with us today here in the Meeting House on Faith Radio. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.